How is it possible to write a play about consensual incest and not have people picketing outside trying to close the theater down? Well, our guest today not only wrote such a play, but she won a Pulitzer Prize for it. Welcome to Women in Theater. I'm Linda Weiner, theater critic and arts columnist of Newsday, and my guest is Paula Vogel, who is one of the most provocative, wickedly funny, deeply empathetic writers that we have today. And of course, I better stop or she'll leave. So Paula, hello. My first question, what were you thinking?
You know, I thought that I would be picketed. I thought, well, actually, no, I didn't even get to the point where I thought there were going to be pickets. I thought, it's fine to write this play because no one will produce it. And I just had to take the journey for myself. I never expected it to be produced. I never expected it to go as far as it did. And it's one of those challenges, you know, that I just thought, I wonder if a woman writer could do this. I wonder if I could look at something and make it gray. Because to me, in real life, emotional issues are gray and not black and white.
I have read that the inspiration was what if the writer of Lolita had been a woman?
Yes.
And is that where you started?
I started with Lolita. I've had an obsession with Lolita since age 20.
You're a sick girl.
I'm a sick girl. I love the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an extraordinary book. I think it's genius. I know all of the film versions of Lolita. I mean, to me, what Nabokov does is something that I ask, can we do that in theater? It's harder to do in theater. A novelist has hundreds and hundreds of pages to be able to play with nuance. In the theater, you're basically at the mercy of actors and directors. And the reason that people didn't picket outside the theater is because of Mark Brokaw, Mary Louise Parker, and David Morse. Had I not had them to be as nuanced on the stage as Lolita is in 100 pages, I think people would have been pretty upset.
And was anyone upset? It's shocking that not only did it become a big commercial success,
right,
but then won a Pulitzer Prize. So, and there just weren't any of the thought police out there saying you mustn't do that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. It's all about timing. Some people were upset who didn't see the play.
That's always the case.
Who heard about the play.
Yeah.
I think people are upset who've gone through incredible extremities of trauma. Victims who have experienced really hideous things.
Yes.
And I kept saying during the preview press, this is not Bastard Out of Carolina. Yeah. It's not meant to be that world.
Yes.
Because I don't think one can be gray or nuanced at a certain point. But I also have been thinking, particularly living in New England and Rhode Island, what a matter of timing is, that it happened before the scandals about the priesthood broke out.
Oh, wow.
I am wondering what our response would be. I mean, this is the thing that's really out of a writer's hands, which is the atmosphere that something lands in. You may be working on something in your head, in your room alone, and you write it never knowing that current events will cause some trigger response, and it's really nothing that one can prepare for.
Wow. The play's called How I Learned to Drive, and it won the Pulitzer in '98. And it's basically about a teenage girl and her uncle.
Yes.
And I've wondered, how did you get the metaphor of the driving?
This may sound very strange, or it's just the way at some point I think as playwrights we're trained to think. I saw the image.
Yeah.
I saw the character a little bit. Yeah. You know, I had an image in my head before Mary Louise Parker stepped forward. Now I can't see her anymore, but the original little bit in my head was driving in the car and adjusted the rear view mirror and saw her uncle in the back, and I went, that's it. Wow. That's the metaphor. And then, of course, thinking about it, we reach an age, not quite of sexual maturity, but sexual initiation at the same time that we're learning to drive. So I didn't quite think about how, as an image or a metaphor, driving would connect or resonate with so many people.
Should have had Del Shannon music on, right?
It should have had Del Shannon music. I actually wrote this in Del Shannon music. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right after that, you had another play open in New York called The Mineola Twins.
Right.
It's about sisters, identical twins, except one has really big breasts.
Right.
And together you link these two plays as the Mammary plays.
Right.
Why?
Why? All right, well, I take what I do as a playwright actually very seriously. I'm always looking over my shoulder and saying, what should we do? Mm-hmm. And to me, what playwrights need to do is go back and look at what the Greeks did. One could not be a Greek playwright and write a tragedy without writing a satirical comedy on the same subject. So I took it quite seriously, and I thought, if I'm going to write How I Learned to Drive, I need to do the burlesque version, which is exactly what the Greek dramatist did. I mean, that may sound a little bit more pretentious than I mean it to, but there's a sense that I have in terms of drama about having sat for 20 years, 30 years in audiences and enjoying things like Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, really enjoying it, loving it, but then wondering, would it be funny if a woman told the jokes? Yeah. Who's telling the jokes?
You thought it wasn't funny anyway, was it?
Well, actually,
sorry.
No, I thought it was. I mean, this is the interesting thing about that. But you see, I mean, in terms of the same mores that have shifted in terms of How I Learned to Drive, have shifted in terms of Mineola twins.
Yes.
When I was doing research, I did research on both simultaneously. I wrote both simultaneously. Have you watched Laugh-In recently?
No.
It's very instructive to go back. Okay, we're talking about the 1960s, and look at Laugh-In. Look at Goldie Hawn. Look at the breast jokes and the hooter jokes on Laugh-In. This is, I don't even want to say this is a surface below. This is still very much part of our kind of cultural knowledge.
And yet, for someone who doesn't know your work,
right,
someone could just have heard what you said and thought, oh, she's talking about something politically correct.
Well, that's an interesting thing about politically correct. Mm-hmm. I mean, people who know me, I don't think have ever used the word politically correct.
Absolutely.
I am interested in where we feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Where is it that we feel uncomfortable? Now, breast jokes is one area that's rife for feeling uncomfortable. I think it's very interesting for me as a woman to go in that direction. I'm very interested in burlesque. I'm very interested in vaudeville. I'm very interested in how women have been used as props. Mm-hmm. Now, that may sound politically correct until you really get into it. Now, look, if you're a writer, you can't just write on one side of the fence. Mm-hmm. You actually have to go in from the other side, and this gets me back to Peck.
Yes.
You can't just write little bit. You have to try to understand the desire and the comedy behind the breast jokes.
Behind the
obsession
and the
with
uncle
breasts.
who actually had the affair with his niece.
Exactly right. You
Yes.
have to go and you have to think about, okay, what is it the television has shown us? What is that? How have I been trained in this culture to, in some ways, participate in either breast jokes, Laugh-In, Lolita? I'm as much a participant as a spectator. And at that point, that's where I call it the gray area. That's where things to me get exciting because they're getting uncomfortable. And a lot of people, actually I'm surprised no one has really jumped all over me, because I do think, for example, that in this culture we are trained to be pedophiles. Mm. I really believe that the culture does that. And just to, for sake of argument, let's go and walk to Times Square and look at the billboards. It's still there. It hasn't gone away. What Laugh-In was doing in the 1960s has not gone away. I don't see that body image has substantially changed. So the question is how do you raise it to the level of consciousness?
And yet you've called yourself a First Amendment feminist.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Can you explain?
Yeah, all right. Why am I a First Amendment a feminist? I've spent a lot of time looking at how we are trained to desire and what we basically censor in this country. And there is a period, now it's interesting, right now we're sitting here on a day where we're worrying about whether or not we're launching a war against Iraq. Yeah. Right now we're worrying about the economy. Right now we're post 9/11. Right now, there are so many real concerns in the world that are on the top layers of our consciousness. To go down to this other layer and say, there was a time when feminists were trying to stop erotica and trying to stop pornography as a danger.
Yeah.
Right now, it may not be the utmost concern to us, but it's below the surface. And
And a year ago, we would have heard about it, or 2 years ago.
a year ago, we would have heard about it.
What about Hot and Throbbing?
Hot and Throbbing is the play that no one is courageous enough to produce in New York. No one. Hot and Throbbing is one of those plays that I was terrified to write. And I always feel if I'm terrified to do something, I better do it.
Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. It's a very upsetting play. It is, and again, not on the topic, but we follow a day in the life of a woman who's writing soft-core pornography for something called Gyno Productions. It's a feminist pornography production company, obviously modeled somewhat on femme productions. And in the course of the evening, we see both her subconscious desires, but also the conscious threat and danger of a husband who's on a restraining order who breaks down the door. I know it is a dangerous play. It's why I wrote it.
But it's been done.
It's been done. There's one...
Arena Stage did it in...
One woman courageous enough to give it a main stage production is Molly Smith.
Yeah.
It's been done in small companies. It was done last year in San Francisco. It's done. It's done in small 90-seat theaters where people are still doing theater because they must do it, not because it pays.
I hate to ask this, but does it matter if the woman is if the artistic director is a woman?
No.
All right.
It doesn't matter.
Because if you look around,
No, it doesn't matter. And actually, I mean, this is, again, in terms of talking about, here we are, women in theater, where one identifies in terms of supporting and producing women does not necessarily align with gender. There are male artistic directors all around the country who are feminist, who are supportive, who are daring. And there are women artistic directors around the country who are not supportive and daring in terms of gender. I mean, I don't mean to categorize. It's very interesting, you know, when we first started in theater in the 60s and 70s with women playwrights, there was this notion that, oh, sisterhood, we were all going to bond together, we were all going to produce plays that had supportive women role models, and we were all going to ride off into the sunset. And I don't think the world works that simplistically.
What I found very depressing, not to be too depressing, there's so much going on right now, but the New York State Council of the Arts had a 3-year study that they published 6 months ago, 8 months ago. And basically it was about women in the theater, and said that although 50% of all scripts that are submitted to artistic directors and theaters are by women, that in fact 16% are produced, and that's actually down from last year. Do you have, what gives?
I read your article on that, as a matter of fact, and I immediately leapt onto the internet and read. I think that actually, you know how I started and said, right now we're worrying at this very moment in time as to whether or not we're going to war with Iraq. And we're worrying about the Bush administration, and we're worrying about the economy. They are not unattached. I think that what indeed happens in terms of race and gender, these matters always are, in a sense, shoved into the background, ignored, as there are more immediate crises. And what happens is that we're taking steps backward. And we're not paying attention right now because we're focusing over here with our, you know, are we going to have a world to wake up to tomorrow?
Yeah, but theaters are still producing plays.
They're producing plays, but what is happening is that what's not being paid attention to are the domestic policies in this country. What's not being paid attention to right now is how are children eating lunch at school. What's not being paid attention to is the poverty level in women. All of these quote-unquote domestic or soft issues are allowed to go unexplored. And right now, because we're in a crisis mode and we want to form a kind of community that supports each other, we want the arts basically to act as our fire that we gather around. We're not going to be held accountable to the same extent in terms of what is happening to the voices of color in this country, what is happening in terms of the voices of women, where are the younger writers, where are the viewpoints that are being shoved to the margin? because right now we're in a time of crisis.
I've heard you describe yourself as a cockroach. What do you mean? I like it.
It shows that I've lived in some of the finer neighborhoods in New
yes,
York
yes.
while being a struggling writer. What that means is that I have to be really truthful at this point. I'm having a lifelong struggle, identity struggle, and that is I love playwrights as much as I love playwriting. I love being in the room with younger artists as they're forming new plays. It's the biggest excitement. Nothing actually matches it.
Yeah. You're still at Brown.
I'm still at Brown. I went back full time this year.
You run the playwriting program?
I'm on the playwriting program. I'm going back to form a new program with Trinity. I tried to stay away because everyone's like, oh, now you won the Pulitzer Prize. And the truth of the matter is those movie meetings in Hollywood didn't have the same thrill as standing in the back of the room. So the cockroach theory is that one of the reasons that I participate in the American theater is that if I can get through the door, I can proselytize and get 10 smaller cockroaches in with me. When you see one cockroach, there's going to be 20 underneath. So the cockroach theory of playwriting is, if you let me in, I want to bring other people through the door with me at an earlier point in their career. It's what I worry about the most.
What was the first time that you went to the theater and something happened to you that made you think, oh my God, I need more of this?
Probably, it was probably a combination of My Fair Lady at the National, seeing a road tour. It was a combination of going to Shady Grove Music Fair.
At the National in Washington.
Yep, in Washington, D.C.
Raised in suburban Baltimore.
I was raised in, suburban Maryland.
Sorry.
And we didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't go often, but I do remember seeing My Fair Lady on the road show, Richard Burton and Julie Andrews in Washington before they came to New York. And finally we managed to go to Shady Grove in the summer. And you know, it's a very strange thing to say, but my first love will always remain musical theater. There's nothing as
I never would have guessed that.
Well, I had told myself that I was going to learn how to write quote-unquote straight plays, pardon the expression,
It's a
to kind of learn my way around writing books. I wrote musicals in college, and I meant to come back. And somehow or other, I got off on this 20-year track. But that's what made me fall in love, that a human being could step out on stage, open their mouth, and music would come out was just remarkable. I still think that's exactly what quote-unquote non-musical theater needs to do.
Well, but you're such a musical writer.
I think that I'm very, I think I'm very influenced by musical theater.
And your brother Carl, can we talk about that
Surely,
a little bit?
absolutely.
Was influential in
Absolutely.
dragging you into this silly world, huh?
He was influential in dragging me into education, saying, you know what, and we can both go to college. I didn't think that was possible. In a strange way, he was influential in me taking the road into theater rather than becoming a fiction writer or becoming a poet, because he was supposed to become the poet, the fiction writer in the family. And I thought, well, theater's not really about writing, and so I took that road instead.
Is it surprising to you in some ways that Baltimore Waltz wasn't the play that got you the most attention? Baltimore Waltz, basically the play about your brother.
Baltimore Waltz, in my opinion, will be the greatest thing I ever write. I will be proudest of that play. I think it broke more ground for me. I think it was an absolutely true expression of my emotion in a given point in time. And, you know, I can't say that I don't enjoy How I Learned to Drive, but when I know that Baltimore Waltz is playing, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, it was even censored in Kuala Lumpur, and they went ahead with it. There's more of a feeling of joy.
Now, this is a play that was basically inspired by the death of your beloved brother of AIDS in 1988 at age 30.
He was almost 38.
Almost 38.
Right.
And it was the fantasy of going to Europe with him. Can you talk about it a bit?
Well, I had never gone to Europe at that point, and my brother, older brother, kind of raised me when my father left home. He became the father figure. He became the person in the family who kind of always paid attention, was always there, always giving me books to read, always there on the phone, when I was starving, sending little checks through the mail. I have no idea how or where he found the money. He was struggling too. And he was also someone who, I don't know how to say this, broke down barriers in the world for me. He was the person in my family who said, racial prejudice is wrong, class prejudice is wrong, prejudice against women is wrong. I still don't know how he kind of formed himself. I think he formed himself from books.
And he asked you to go to Europe?
He asked me to go to Europe. He didn't tell me that he thought he was HIV positive. I was struggling in New York at the time and couldn't afford it and said, I can't go. And he said, I'll pay for it. And I said, no, I can't let you do that. Thinking, of course, as we always think, that there's always enough time to do it in the future. So I wrote the play in my mind in the hospital.
Did he? Is it true that he looked up at you and said, "You're going to write about this, aren't you?"
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. And I had never, at that point, tried anything that was that immediate to me. That was the first time that I've ever tried really to look at theater as a pure expression of emotion. And it was that play. So when I talk to people about my experience in the theater, I said about Baltimore Waltz that if a bus hit me the next day in the street, I'd die a happy woman, because I finally stood in the theater and was happy in the room. Everything came together for me. I loved my director, Anne Bogart. I loved Cherry Jones. I loved the designers. I loved the interns. And there was a sense of it doesn't get any better than that. And in fact, it never has. That moment was absolutely pure joy. And the only other thing I can say about this is I'm becoming more aware of theater as a result of my brother's death, that theater is a way of sending messages. It may not be to the living. It may be that it's a bottle and a cork, and you write your letter, and you put the cork in the bottle and you throw it into the ocean, and you just pray that it washes up on the shore where the ancestors or the dead reside. And the theater serves that function as well.
So where have you been? How come we haven't seen you since the Mineola twins?
I've been deliberately staying out. I've been taking a step back. I've been reevaluating it.
Does that mean not writing?
No, I've written something new, but to do that, I've had to sort of retreat. Someone once said, and I don't know who it was, that when they're in New York, they worry about what other people are writing. But when they're outside of New York, they worry about what they're writing. I had to do the obligatory trip to Hollywood, pitching the pilot, doing the screenplays, just to experience that. And I feel very much like Judy Garland now in Wizard of Oz. If I don't find my own happiness in my own backyard, ... So it's been a roundabout way, but this next play that I've been working on is extremely difficult and personal, and it's...
Can you talk about it, or rather not?
I'll try to.
Okay.
I haven't talked about it yet, but
Okay.
I'll try to. In many ways, it's a prequel to How I Learned to Drive. And this,
How I Learned to Skate?
It's How I Learned to Skate. Yes, it's How I Learned to Skate. It's a perspective of family from the backseat of the car, from children. I tend to write, as you know, with Mineola Twins and How I Learned to Drive, I tend to write plays together. So I'm writing two plays, and I've written the first one called The Christmas Plays. The second play will be The Civil War Christmas. That will happen in Washington, D.C., a musical that takes place Christmas Eve, 1864.
A musical.
About the collision using extant music, Christmas carols, Civil War ballads. And this first one is... it's a response to The Long Christmas Dinner by Thornton Wilder. It's a little bit of a response to my brother showing me Fanny and Alexander. And the only way I can say this is I'm grappling in middle age with how distance makes even trauma beautiful, a terrible beauty, as Yeats once said. So it's combining a little bit of the Bergman sensibility with a little bit of Thornton Wilder.
I have one last question.
Sure.
As a woman, if there was one thing you could do right now to change the theater, what would it be? I would ask artistic directors, somehow or other,
to read the scripts written by women as if they're every bit as universal as scripts written by David Mamet. That's what I would do.
My wish would be there'd be more Paula Vogel plays.
That's very lovely of
Anyway,
you.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. On behalf of the League of Professional Theater Women, I'm Linda Weiner, and this is Women in Theater.